Chaired by China and hosted by Canada, COP15 resulted in the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework last December. 196 parties inked their name on this document amid dangerous decline in nature and a failure of previous Aichi biodiversity target. Dr. David Cooper, who witnessed this historic achievement, shared his thoughts on the global goals of the framework, review the marathon negotiations and disagreements, and of course, China's presidency of COP15.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cooper, for joining us to talk this very important issues.
Thank you for this opportunity to join you.
We know the biodiversity is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history, and the rate of species extinctions is accelerating. What do you think are the main drivers for the rapid loss of natural biodiversity on a global scale?
There's the biggest of all for biodiversity on land is land use change, the way we manage land, and also infrastructure development, overfishing and destructive fishing practices. Other factors are pollution and invasive alien species. And then, of course, climate change is becoming a bigger threat all the time as well. It will also become a major driver. And of course, behind all of these drivers is unsustainable economic development, overconsumption of certain materials, wasteful consumption driven by misdirected subsidies. We need to address this issue this decade. We need to take action now, in fact. Otherwise, we risk undermining all of the gains in development that we have achieved around the world, in China, in other countries around the world, the past decades.
So what is the historic significance of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework adopted at COP15?
And I think this was a symbolic example of multilateralism at work. That even when we are living in perhaps difficult geopolitical times, that the world can still come together through the United Nations to agree on tackling issues of common concern to humanity. It's a very good agreement. It's a very ambitious agreement. It's a strong agreement, but it is only a document. It needs to be implemented. These are global goals and targets. They're not legally binding. So the first thing they need to do is to determine their national targets towards these global goals.
The framework set 4 large global goals for biodiversity conservation and translated them into 23 targeted actions, aiming to protecting at least 30% of the world's land and sea, sharing the benefits of using genetic information and global fund to support those actions.
So this is a balanced package. We can't achieve the conservation and sustainable use that we need if we don't invest the resources to do so. And we need to make sure that there's an equitable sharing of benefits. So that's why we have these 4 goals. The specifics of the goals, those goals are for 2050, that we know that can be achieved when we look at the science.
COP15 GBF has been under 4 years of marathon negotiations. What are the main disagreements facing the negotiations?
I guess the first was this level of ambition. How ambitious should we try to be? So that's the first. And that was reflected perhaps in one of the targets that it was the most well known that was under discussion, and that's the targets for protected areas. The second biggest issue, I would say, was the whole issue of finance. And then the third major issue of discussion was over how we regulate the use of digital sequence information. That is, the information in genetic resources.
Well, talked about the allocation of funds. What can we do in COP15 to ensure the funds promised by the developed countries will be applied to the developing countries for their protection of local biodiversity resources? Because as we can see, on the Paris Agreement of COP21, the developed countries failed to commit to provide $100 billion per year to developing countries.
You're right, that now has to be implemented. I think there are 2 other mechanisms. So one is something that applies to all of the targets, and that is the monitoring framework. So there are indicators established for each of the targets, and there will be regular review of progress towards those. The second is also established a new advisory committee on resource mobilization, to further develop a strategy for resource mobilization. So there will be continued discussions on this matter involving all parties.
Another historic breakthrough during COP15 was the inclusion of digital sequence information on genetic resources, or DSI. Genetic resources contain valuable information that can be utilized in various fields, such as pharmaceuticals, biotech products, and new agricultural crops. DSI is not a new concept, as it has built into the convention since 1992, and with the development of technology, the management of genetic resources has been digitized through global databases. So the challenge here is, how do countries share the benefits in a fair and equitable way?
They agreed to establish a multilateral mechanism to do that. We want to make sure when that happens that the countries providing these resources can get a fair share. The details of that multilateral mechanism, which will include a new fund, now have to be negotiated among the parties over this 2-year period. In fact, before COP16, which will take place in Turkey in October 2024.
So how can we ensure that contents of the Kunming-Montreal GBF is fair and equitable to all member countries? In particular, how can the interests of developing countries be safeguarded?
I should also note that while, of course, we know that in general terms, it's the developed countries that have more technological capacity, that it's not an absolute division between developed and developing countries in this regard. This mechanism on access and benefit sharing, including now on digital sequence information, is between countries providing resources and countries using resources. So this is not a straightforward developed countries, developing countries issue. This is about countries that are using resources and countries that are providing resources. And there's a big overlap between those two groups. All countries can build up the capacity to benefit from their own resources, as well as those they access from other countries.
The framework proposes to ensure that by 2030, at least 30% of areas of degraded terrestrial, inland water, and coastal and marine ecosystems are under effective restoration. So in face of the different potential for ecological protection in different countries, how do we define this 30% of the protection areas? What work needs to be done on this?
Of course, the countries with, generally speaking, the countries with the greater potential are those that have more degraded areas. In general terms, include a lot of the more developed countries, because they have a higher percentage of areas that have been degraded. But the targets are global. We know that, in recent years in China, for example, there's been major advances in developing a national protected areas network. The Chinese redlining system is also a very good basis for further work. We're therefore very pleased. Shortly after the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in Montreal in December, we saw last month the agreement on the new instrument under the UN Law of the Sea to protect biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction.
COP15 is the first major global environmental event presided over by China. Amid those challenges, the country proved its presidency is hard to be replaced in reaching this global agreement.
I think China has, in recent years, and a number of initiatives that have demonstrated that it is possible for a country rapidly developing to also care about the environment. I think China was very skillful in working to identify this potential compromise, but not just any compromise, a compromise at a high level, at an ambitious level, that could then get agreement. And I think this was a symbolic example of multilateralism at work, that even when we are living in perhaps difficult geopolitical times, that the world can still come together through the United Nations to agree on tackling issues of common concern to humanity. So I'm hopeful that we will be able to have an approach that all countries in the world can engage with and participate in.